Carmen, we wanted to go ahead and record this meeting, so I wanted to make sure that that was fine for you. Is that okay? Good.
Yeah. I just got the.
Yeah, I should have asked before.
No problem.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. I think we'll wait a couple more minutes as people arrive.
I'm already seeing some familiar names joining us, so good to have you here, Mariola and Natalia.
Okay, so it's about 3 minutes past the hour, so maybe we go ahead and start with the introduction and then let people join as they come in. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our new seminar series, Gender Research and Action in the Global South. It's hosted by the University of Oxford. This is a new monthly seminar that aims to draw on from diverse backgrounds and countries of expertise. It's a multidisciplinary series that provides a space for discussing approaches and nuances in research and gender and development. So it's hosted by 3 of us here at the University of Oxford, and we're all working on gender from different disciplines. So it's from Marina Corzin-Vecchia, and Marina is a human geographer. She's a postdoctoral researcher in ethnography at the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment. Rob Farito, and he's a DPhil candidate in geography and the environment. And then myself, I'm Maria Hillisland, and I'm a development economist at the Oxford Department of International Development. So today, we have Dr. Carmen Diana Deere, who will present consensual unions, property rights, and patrimonial violence against women in Latin America. Dr. Deere is a distinguished professor emerita of Latin American Studies and Food and Resource Economics at the University of Florida. She's a distinguished professor at the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences in Quito, Ecuador, and a former director of the University of Florida Center for Latin American Studies. She earned a PhD in agricultural economics from the University of California, Berkeley, and a master's in development studies from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. She's a feminist development economist, and her research is focused largely on women's property rights and gender inequality in asset ownership in Latin America, among other topics. She served as president of Latin American Studies Association and then recently received the association's highest distinction for scholarship and service in the profession. It's the Carmen Silvert Award. So we will have her present her work for for 30 minutes, and then we will open it up for questions. So what we're doing though is we're encouraging you to ask your questions in the comments box as Dr. Deere presents. And then we'll sort these by topic if needed for the Q&A session. We'll ask you if you want to ask her directly yourself, so we'll unmute you, or you of course can also have us ask her. So, okay, Carmen, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Maria, for that introduction, and all three of you for the invitation. Let me get this PowerPoint set up. Oops. And put my timer on. You said 30 minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm delighted to present this paper to you. It's by Magdalena Leon and myself. Magdalena is a Colombian sociologist. And we consider this our COVID paper. You know, it's one of those papers that grew out of an idea that we had from many conversations before COVID. We had actually started exploring different avenues around marital status and patrimonial violence, and it very much took shape, you know, under the constrained conditions, right, that we've all been living under for the past year. So I'll be pointing out some of those improvisations that happen under these circumstances as we go along. Okay, the major question that we address relates to the common association of married women's property rights as the measure of progress on women's rights and women's property rights in specific. And that, of course, makes sense, since it's married women who tend to lose some of their former rights when they marry, right? In the sense that, particularly in countries following the Roman law tradition or common law, single women and widows tend to have stronger rights than married women. But we question this because it really depends on a number of factors. And this is where you have to take into account consensual unions. You know, are the majority of women of, let's say, childbearing age in marriages or consensual unions? Do marriages and consensual unions have similar property rights? And are formal property rights realized in practice? And if not, you know, are there differences between what happens to married women versus those in consensual union? So what we show for Latin America in this paper is that consensual unions are now more frequent than marriages in most age groups. Also, we show that progress in strengthening the property rights of women in consensual unions historically has been slow and uneven. But today, in most countries, women in consensual unions do have similar property rights to those in marriages. Nonetheless, and this addresses the gap between formal property rights and what happens in practice, we see that women in consensual unions face higher rates of intimate partner violence, and specifically economic and patrimonial violence. So let me give you a bit of context for considering this question of consensual unions versus marriages. What we now know from the historical studies is that in the 19th century, marriage was pretty much limited to the white and mestizo, middle and upper classes. You know, that is, it was not universal. And that it's really a 20th century phenomena. You know, during the first half of the 20th century is really where marriage became the dominant marital or status, civil status for women in their childbearing years. Although even then there was some regional variation, with consensual unions being much more frequent in Central America and the Caribbean than in the Southern Cone, for example. And this variation by class, race, and ethnicity continued, with consensual unions being more common among those with lower levels of education and income, Afro-descendants, as well as some indigenous groups, although it very much depends on the country. Okay, turning to when we really have the best comparative data, if we turn to the second half of the 20th century, and just take a look at 1970 for a sample of 6 of the South American countries. And there you can see even regional differences within it. If you look at the countries that had the lowest share of partner women in consensual unions, and here I'm looking at the 25 to 29-year-old age group. You can see that in the Southern Cone countries, it's sort of like less than 10% were in consensual unions. This is why we can talk about marriage really being the standard in the Southern Cone. But looking just at the Andean countries that are the top 3 colors, there you get as high as 30% in the 1970s. But something begins to happen in the 1980s across the board, both in the countries that were the marrying countries and those of Central America and the Caribbean, where consensual unions were much more common. Basically, that you can start to see this switch where consensual unions eventually become the majority form of union. Excuse me. Okay, so besides that trend, the other one that really stands out is how the growth in consensual unions has taken place across class, that it's grown among all different educational and income levels, and also across all age cohorts, which means that people aren't just living together to try things out to eventually marry, but considering consensual unions more permanent status. So turning to the literature, which is still relatively small, on why these trends, generally everyone comes back to women's increased economic independence, right? That these trends are associated with the growth of women's labor force participation and earnings. Nonetheless, there's a small literature that's also started to examine the motives for consensual unions, and that these might vary by gender and class. And I'll come back to this point at the end because it's very relevant when thinking about policy analysis. Let me turn then to the legal framework, because one of the main contributions of this paper is to go through the framework for consensual unions, as well as on intimate partner violence and economic and patrimonial violence specifically. We examine in the paper 4 components of what we consider to be women's property rights. Patrimonial rights is basically the marital regime, or what happens to the assets, property that are acquired during the marriage, and do the same rules apply to consensual unions as to marriages? Well, in most of Latin America, it's some variation of partial community property that's the default. And we can talk about this in more detail if you're interested in the discussion. A second important component is whether women have the same inheritance rights with respect to their partner, should they widow, as marriages. Also, if they have the right to alimony or maintenance if they're separated. And finally, if their children have the same rights to make maintenance and inheritance as children from marriages. I'm not going to go through all these components now, but let me give you the summary of the most important trends. Usually recognition, when we use the term recognition of consensual unions, we're referring to recognition of the patrimonial rights or what happened, the rules to what happens to property. And as you can see in this table, prior to 1955, very few countries had recognized consensual unions. Just 6. And what all 6 of these have in common is that a large share of their population is either Afro-descendant or indigenous. So it was probably in response to the need to give some kind of formal status to the property rights of men and women in these unions that these countries were the first to enact some kind of legislation. The great majority of countries recognize consensual unions after CEDAW. In other words, it's once again the second wave of the women's movement, of the feminist movement in the 1970s and 80s, that really starts to draw attention to first female heads of household and the importance of marital status in the determination of women's property rights. So this is why we get the large number of countries, that now recognize the patrimonial rights. Finally, we've got the laggards, those that don't get around to recognizing them until this century. What's interesting here is that Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile only recognize the property rights of consensual unions as part of their recognition of same-sex unions. In other words, it wasn't the problem of a mixed couple, but it was because, of all of the demands based on gay rights, that the legislation was finally changed, giving them property rights. Just to give you an idea on how these different components of property rights were enacted really in a very slow and piecemeal fashion, put a little star by the only countries that recognize the inheritance rights at death of couples in consensual unions at the same time that they did the patrimonial rights. See that it's only about half of the countries that gave both rights at the same time. Really, in most, it was the slow, drawn-out process. And if we fast forward today, while in almost all 19 countries that we study, women in consensual unions now have the same property rights. We still have a couple laggards. In Argentina and the Dominican Republic, they lack inheritance rights. And in Ecuador and the Dominican Republic, they lack the right to maintenance support. Turning to the domestic violence legislation, in 1994, probably one of the most influential conventions in Latin America was agreed to, the Belém do Pará Convention, that basically recognized the problem of domestic violence and proposed penalties for infractions. Immediately thereafter, all countries enacted some form of legislation. But this first round of domestic violence legislation really focused on intrafamilial violence, not violence against women because of their gender per se. And it also, tended to highlight physical, psychological, and sexual violence while excluding economic and patrimonial violence, with only 3 exceptions. Costa Rica, in many ways, was the pioneer by developing the concept in its 1990s legislation. So it was just in the second round of domestic violence legislation in the decade of the 2000s and 2010s that we see the majority of countries recognizing that economic and patrimonial violence was a form of violence, and that it was as prejudicial as the other physical, psychological, and sexual violence. But we still have 2 laggards in the region. Chile and Cuba, interesting enough, are the only 2 countries that have not formally recognized economic and patrimonial violence. Well, what do we mean by EPV, as I will call it for short? Some countries in their legislation basically group economic and patrimonial violence together, but we think it's useful to separate them, as did Uruguay in their latest legislation, because each focuses on a somewhat different process. Economic violence really focuses on women's income, right? And the behavior that limits or controls, tries to impede women's access or control of it. Whereas patrimonial violence focuses on assets and property, and all the different ways that women can suffer, or how harm can be done to women's either access or control of assets. Let me turn now to what are really the pioneering attempts to try to measure economic and patrimonial violence in surveys. And as I'll be demonstrating, we're still pretty much in the these are very much the initial years of this work. We've got a long way to go. Well, Mexico was the very first, the 2006 Family Relations Survey. It was followed by Ecuador, that's now done 2 of these. And then Colombia modified its DHS survey in 2015 to try to capture some aspects of economic and patrimonial violence. Well, we were very pleased that Ecuador and Colombia did have some quantitative data, since these are the 2 countries that Magdalena and I know best and have been working on recently. So the rest of my presentation focuses on our 2 case study countries. And what we did was really just work up the descriptive data for a number of reasons, but one being that the 2 surveys really aren't that comparable. Okay, first, consider the incidence of violence against women by their current partner over the length of the relationship. This is what is usually called, erroneously, lifetime violence, because in at least these 2 countries were measuring over that specific relationship that they're currently in. And first, consider the column on the far right, which is any form of violence. And you'll see a really important contrast between these 2 countries. Basically, that the rates of any kind of violence are much, much higher in Colombia than they are in Ecuador, right? And it's not quite double, but it's strikingly so. Second, that focusing on the differences in the incidence of intimate partner violence between married women and those in consensual unions. In Colombia, not only is any violence significantly different, but when we look at all of the components, economic, physical, psychological, the differences in these rates are statistically significant, but not in the case of Ecuador, where we're looking over the length of the relationship. However, once we go to past year violence, these differences, at least for economic, physical, and psychological violence, and any kind of violence in Ecuador, are also statistically significant. So that's something else we can discuss later, is why do we get these differences between violence over the length of the relationship versus past year. Okay, finally here, I want to point out another interesting contrast between the two countries. You can see here in Colombia, considering just economic and physical violence, that the rates are very similar, right? So for Colombia, we can say that economic violence is as important, as physical violence in terms of the harm for women. But when we look at Ecuador, we see that physical violence really prevails over economic violence. And this trend also holds over the past 12 months. Okay, I'm going to switch now to the past 12 months where we do have significant results for both countries to examine the different questions that were asked to measure any kind of or any type of economic and patrimonial violence. Here you can see that women in consensual unions have a much higher incidence across the board than married women. But once we disaggregate, the only other question, or the one question that is statistically significantly different, is whether your partner prohibited you from working or studying. Otherwise, as we go down the scale in their frequency, while still the share of women in consensual unions reporting that your partner has taken or spent your money is higher than for married women, these differences aren't statistically significant. Not that your financial obligations to the household, that he's taken the animals you were raising, made himself owner of your assets, taken or destroyed documents, destroyed personal items. Turning to Colombia, rather than Ecuador's 7 questions, we only have 5 questions. Here, as you can see by the stars, the differences between the incidents reported by women in consensual unions and married women is always significant. The top ranking response was that their husband or partner scrutinized their spending, followed by his having prevented them from working or studying. Let's see, has a very different question here, threatened to withdraw his support. Well, there's lots of problems with these surveys, starting with the fact that Ecuador has 7 questions, Colombia only has 5. The number of questions doesn't seem to really influence the response, since we saw such a big difference, right, and a much higher rate reported in Colombia than in Ecuador. But some of the questions in Colombia's survey are what we might call iffy, right? It's using a couple of the DHS questions that are usually included in other categories. For example, threatening to withdraw support has always been part of psychological violence in the DHS surveys. And having scrutinized her spending is usually part of controlling behavior. So we're not sure. Well, let's just say, this is something that we need to study in the sense of what do these questions really capture and what do they best measure, right? From our point of view, and given our interest in assets, the major problem is that Colombia only asked one question related to assets, but Ecuador asked four. Moreover, neither survey asked about joint assets. And both these countries are countries that are governed by the partial community property regime, where all assets that are acquired during the marriage are the property of both the husband and wife, or the man and the woman. What qualitative studies suggest is that it's joint property that is really the most vulnerable in terms of women being denied their property rights. So not to include any kinds of questions that are dealing with joint property is really a problem. And these are among the reasons that we decided not to do more sophisticated multivariate analysis on these data sets, because they weren't comparable, and we don't think that these are really good measures, although it's the starting point. What we hope is that our analysis and this paper will, of course, urge others to experience or to experiment in their own survey research with a much broader number of questions to see which best captures the phenomena we want to measure. Well, let me then end with a discussion of some of the qualitative research that's been carried out on the women in consensual unions exercising their property rights. And unfortunately, there's not much. We're drawing on one really good study for Colombia, and then a study that I was involved with as part of the Assets Project in Ecuador. What both of these studies concluded was that there's a very low level of legal literacy among women in the lower income sectors in particular. A lot of confusion about what the property rights are of married women, not to mention those in consensual unions. Although, it was generally understood that in a marriage, anything you acquired belongs to both of you. People simply didn't have a clue what was supposed to happen in a consensual union. But the default is really separation of property. When things aren't clear, then people assume that what you earn and what you purchase with your income is your own, and nothing is shared. So that's really the informal default. Another problem in both countries is that to really exercise your property rights, you need to register your union. If you don't, if you wait, for example, until your partner dies and then try to establish that you're his widow and you have a right to half of the house, even though it's in his name, it becomes much more difficult. You have to hire a lawyer, you have to go to court, you have to get proof that you live together in a consensual union for all of those years. So that's why registration is so important, but there's very few people really realize how important it is. We happened in our assets survey that we carried out in 2010 in Ecuador, we did ask folks in consensual unions if their relationship, their union was registered. And we found that only 9% of those were registered. For Colombia, we did get access to the registration data, and after a bunch of acrobatics, came up with an estimate that at most 2.5% are registered. All of this, even though it turns out that it's cheaper to register them in Colombia than in Ecuador. But in Ecuador, with registration, you get a bigger bang to your buck. You actually get an ID card that lists a consensual union as your official marital status. So that's really important when it comes to the enforcement of joint titling. Also in Ecuador, they're pretty good about following the law on the acquisition of immovable property. So if you buy a house, or if you buy also a car or stocks, if your ID shows that you're married, it has to be registered in the name of both of you. So that's what gives you, of course, the strongest documentation to assure your property rights. So we are hopeful that this, in the case of Ecuador, will make a difference. The problem in Colombia is that they don't show your marital status on your ID card. So, there's really sort of no extra incentive to do so to guarantee your property rights. Also, based on our qualitative research, we also found that it wasn't always clear that women considered registration to be in their interest. That is, there's some good reasons why they might prefer the informal separation of property. And that's related to the very unstable nature of consensual unions themselves. For example, in the Ecuador survey, almost a third of the women in consensual unions were in their second or third live-in relationship, compared to only 8% of married women being in a second or more relationship. What this means is that women are likely to have had children by different men, and their current partner has likely fathered other children. So that's led to a situation where if property is acquired during the union, women often really struggle to make sure that the property is registered in the name of the children that she's had with that particular man, right? So she forgoes her own property rights for the welfare of her kids. And it's another reason why she might find it in her interest not to register, not to have community property, but to keep her own property so that she can pass on just whatever she purchases herself, by herself, to her own kids, and other kids don't end up having some kind of right in it. Finally, another barrier or obstacle is that you need your partner's agreement to register. Well, in a relationship where there's already been intimate partner violence, it certainly could incite more intimate partner violence. So this is another reason that women that do know that they need to register to gain access to or to assure their rights to community property may defer from doing so. Okay, to conclude. Overall, I hope I've convinced you that, in Latin America, there's been a tremendous amount of progress at the legal level, right? That women now in consensual unions in most countries have quite strong formal property rights. But what we have is this disjuncture between law and practice. We see it in the very high rates of economic and patrimonial violence among women in consensual unions, and in Colombia in particular. And in both countries, when considering past year violence, we do have the same result. The women in consensual unions are more likely to experience it than married women. But we need very much to improve the measurement of economic and patrimonial violence, I think, to really begin to draw firm conclusions. The one policy recommendation that we end up with, and one that we consider to be really urgent, is the need for legal literacy campaigns. I think we could all agree that we need to at least increase women's knowledge of their options so that they can make informed choices about what's the very best for them. Thank you. Maria, back to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Carmen. That was interesting and fantastic presentation. So I want to encourage everybody who has a question or comment to please write their questions in the chat, and we will then ask you to ask Carmen yourself. And I do have one question for you while we wait on the questions, Carmen. So you had mentioned that the measures in the surveys do not capture economic partner violence well, they're a good starting point, but they don't capture them in the best way. And so I'm just curious, from your standpoint, what would be a good way to capture this and also measure economic partner violence?
I think that what we need to do is just a lot more experimentation. Going back to our own work in the asset survey, and maybe I should explain to all that in 2010, Maria and Cheryl Doss and I and other colleagues were part of a comparative study in Ecuador, Ghana, and in the state of Karnataka in India, where we did the first household level surveys asking about the individual ownership of assets. And that survey was preceded by 6 months of qualitative work. And I will confess, I don't think any of us had really thought about economic and patrimonial violence when we began that work. So we didn't include it in our survey. But as we were doing the focus groups, in Ecuador, it came out really strongly. And so we were getting all of these examples, but we didn't analyze the qualitative data until much later on that year. Really, as we were doing the survey, we were involved in executing the survey and then analyzing the qualitative data. But we really missed the chance because it wasn't until we finished with that analysis that we saw the importance of economic and patrimonial violence. So it was really too late to test, new questions that we could have added to the survey. The only one that we had in the survey ended up just being too broad and vague to be of any use. And that was if you were separated or divorced, if you lost assets, right? Well, everyone said, of course we lost assets, because it would have, joint assets would be divided in half, so it's sort of you would, of course, by definition, have less than you had before. So that's the kind of a dumb question you don't want to do. It was really after we finished the survey and had written we ended up writing, I think, maybe 2 or 3 papers on patrimonial violence, that we really began to understand its components, to go back and start to test a questionnaire, right? So I don't have a list with me for you to share, but as we all know, it took, I think, a good 20 years to end up with the really detailed what's it called? The tactical scale for physical and psychological and sexual violence. They were tested and over tested to agree on the basic questions that have now become pretty standard. Well, we're just at the beginning of that in terms of economic and patrimonial violence. So I hope I've interested some of you into carrying this work further. I don't plan to do any more surveys myself. Maria, I can't hear you. Yeah, not sure what has happened. Can others hear her, or is it just me?
Maria?
I can't hear Maria.
Maria, are you?
Hi, Carmen. Just few minutes to see you, but I in another Zoom. Grateful. Are you going to record? Are you recording, and then will you be able to send us the conference?
Hi,
The ones that were.
Okay.
Yes. Oh, that will be excellent. Well, very nice to see you, everybody. Carmen, and I see you on Monday. Bye-bye.
Bye. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, great. Sorry about that. So we have a question from Viviana. Viviana, are you there? And can we unmute you? Yeah, great.
Yeah, thank you. Carmen, it's a pleasure to hear you. And my question is about, in addition to the joint registration of property, how can rural land women's rights be guaranteed in Latin America? I do this question because it's related to SDG 582. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want me to take question by question, Maria, or do you want to get several?
Yeah, let's do one more. So we do two, and then because I want to make sure that we make it in time. And so maybe two at a time. So we also have Mariola. Mariola, do you want to go ahead? It looks like you have a couple questions.
Hi, Carmen. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have two questions. I was wondering whether you also examine if literacy levels are higher in married couples, and if this could explain whether why they are experiencing lower rates of patrimonial violence. And my second question, I was just wondering whether you have some hypothesis why the last year violence was significantly higher than other years. And if you see a trend of increased gender-based violence in the region, or was this really relating to 2020? It could have been related to COVID-19. Thank you so much.
Okay, lots of good questions. Okay, on the first one on rural women's land rights, it's important to think in terms of how women acquire land, right? We've got through land reform, we have the market, purchase with credit and savings, and we've got inheritance. And I think each one of those deserves a separate focus. Joint registration we consider absolutely necessary in the case of land reform, right? If a government's intervening in the distribution of assets, just basic social justice principles, say that both adult men and women should receive land in their names. In terms of the market, here it depends a bit on the marital regimes. I think that for a long time in development studies, we didn't pay enough attention to the legal frameworks and how those play out in and daily life. And I think that that was one of the great contributions of the Assets Project, by working in countries that were so different with different marital regimes. We saw that the same policy recommendations didn't really have the same relevancy, in each country because of these variations. So at least for countries where the marital regime is partial community property, there, by requiring joint title, such as in the case that I mentioned of Ecuador, if you buy a house and you're married, you have to show your ID and it has to come out in the names of, or be registered in the names of both of you. I think it's different in countries that have separation of property. There, and we found in Ghana and India, it's much more difficult to require joint titling when your legal framework has been one of separation of property. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it does mean that it's a different conversation about the role of the state and how it's intervening. And then when we get to inheritance, and I think that inheritance it's so important in terms of land. In our comparative study, we found that inheritance is the #1 way that women acquire land. Generally from one of their parents, or in some cases in Ghana and India, through their husbands. This really puts a spotlight on the importance of inheritance legislation. And then again, not only do you need sort of gender neutral legislation that doesn't discriminate against women, but you have to work really hard to change ingrained patriarchal notions, that land should go to sons, or the eldest son, or the youngest son, but most generally sons. So what I'm saying is that, while we do have quick and easy responses, joint titling, joint registration, that we think work most places, it's really important to take care, or to look at the context and that full legal framework to plot your strategy if you really want to be successful. Turning to Mariola's question, first, the 2019 survey was done before COVID, right? So it doesn't have a COVID factor in it. And on the role of literacy, you're absolutely right. The value of doing regression analysis is that we can control, for education, income, etc. So that's what you'd want to do. We didn't go in that direction for two reasons. And one of it is my COVID story, which was that when we originally conceived this paper, it was just going to be a paper on Colombia, and we were going to do it with Pro Familia, which is it's a private agency in Colombia, but that is the government's contractor for all of the DHS surveys. So they were really interested in this study, and it was going to be a collaborative effort. Well, we spent sort of 6 months sort of figuring out what we wanted them to be able to do. And then COVID hit, and they were locked down, they were sent home, and they weren't even allowed back in their offices for 6 months, right? They didn't have access to the data set. There was no way that they could download it. It was just sort of one delay and the other. Well, Magdalena and I, never ones to get bored, decided, well, we might as well start looking at some other countries, right? And so, so I knew, of course, about the Ecuador survey. So we, were able to hire someone to start doing some work on that. anyway, we ended up examining all 19 countries in terms of both pieces of legislation and realized, that itself was a paper. So that's the COVID story on that one. Going to why past year is significantly different, but lifetime is not. What I think is happening is that consensual unions, the duration of consensual unions is much shorter, right, than marriages. I don't think I have that piece of data here, but I did mention in the presentation that, in almost 1/3 of the unions, they're in their second or third relationship. So it stands to reason that, let's say, I'll just pick numbers out of the sky, but if the average length is 5 years, whereas for a marriage, it's 15, then your reference period for violence during the relationship is really different between the two groups. So in a consensual union, if you have economic and patrimonial violence related, I think you're much more likely to report it during the past year. But because if it happens and you don't like it, it's so much easier to leave, right? The exit costs are much lower than from a marriage. So if you experience it, you leave, which gives you high past year violence. But when you look at the length of the relationship, those that didn't experience it that stay will then be reporting lower lifetime experiences of violence. Okay. Hope you followed that argument. But it's really looking at it's the concept of exposure to something. And when we're looking at consensual unions and marriages, we're looking at apples and oranges, in terms of the processes of how they're created and how they dissolve, right? So in general, though, I've always favored looking at past year violence as a much more solid comparative indicator, because it's really at a moment in time when the violence happens that you really have an accurate capture of all of the other factors or variables, right? Independent variables in terms of age, work experience, et cetera, et cetera. Once you're looking at over the relationship, 1,000 other things have happened and could be going on. So I don't think it's as clean for comparative analysis.
So Carmen, we have 2 minutes and we do have another interesting question. So we squeeze that in there. So Jessica,
Yeah,
you want to
sure.
go ahead and ask
Thanks.
yours? Okay.
Sure. Thanks so much for the presentation, Carmen. So I was under the impression that in many Latin American countries that at the point of civil marriage, that you select either an assets in common regime or a separate assets regime for your marriage. And I'm completely confident this is the case in Mexico, but I also understand that it's the case in Ecuador as well. And so I don't know if that information is collected in any of the surveys you've used, and how those two different regimes might play into some of your study questions.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And we've definitely been recommending in all of our survey work that people include a question as to under what regime were you married, because that's something that none, of the traditional household surveys have included, and it's really important. Yet now in most Latin American countries, there is a choice at marriage. I mean, not just between separate property and partial community property, but also full community property, where everything is pooled, both what you owned before marriage as well as during marriage. Actually, Ecuador is one of the few where you don't have a choice, but you can do what's called capitulaciones, which is a prenup. And you can actually do that kind of prenup now at any moment during the marriage. So you can change it to suit your circumstances. You know, we did ask the question in our survey, in terms of, have you ever done a prenuptial agreement? And on that one, it was very interesting because we did get just a very few responses, all from divorced women, you know, making you think that it was, you know, it was because they suffered patrimonial violence in their first marriage that, you know, they ended up knowing enough, right? So in their second relationship, you know, they did go for an alternative. And if you're interested in protecting the property rights of your kids from your first marriage, that it would be separate property would be the way to go. Okay, thank you for these questions. We could certainly talk about them for much longer. Hope I didn't take too much time.
No, well, thank you. It was such an honor to have you in our seminar, Carmen Diana. And thanks to everybody that joined us. It was great questions, and we look forward to having you at our next seminar. So our next seminar will be on the 16th of July at 3 p.m. So I think that's 10 p.m. or 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and that will be a presentation by Ruth Mazendik on challenges and rewards of integrating qualitative and quantitative data in gender research. So thanks so much. Thanks again, Carmen, and looking forward to seeing everybody at the next session.
Thank you. Enjoyed it a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.